this is such a contrast with the traditional approach to philosophy that I think it's worth going over it again, perhaps in slightly different terms. That from Descartes onwards, philosophers had thought of the human being as a subject relating to objects, and therefore, because of that, the central philosophical problems were seen to be how do we as subject have knowledge of these objects. And the central problems to which philosophers addressed themselves were about perception, about whether we have any certain knowledge at all, if so, how we got it, how we knew we had it, and so on. Now, Heidegger isn't saying that these problems don't exist, but what he's saying is that this is not what is central to the human situation. We aren't, as it were, separate subjects looking through some invisible plate glass window at an objective reality which is out there and to which we try to relate or of which we try to get knowledge. We are, from the beginning, in amongst it all. We are in there in the world, so to speak, coping with it, so that we are not primarily observing or knowing beings at all in the way that traditional philosophers have treated us as being. We're coping beings, or he might have been inclined to say, we're being beings. And it's from there that we start.
That's right. It's a relationship of, for instance, as Gilbert Ryle put it when he reviewed Being in Time. He reviewed both Being in Time and Husserl's logical investigations. He thought they were both good, but he thought Heidegger was really onto something interesting. Ryle distinguished knowing that, which is what the tradition had always been interested in, from knowing how, which is what he took Heidegger to be interested in. And that isn't just to claim the primacy of practical activity, though that's radical enough. The pragmatists have claimed that, too. It was to have an analysis of practical activity that didn't need to bring in mental content, like desiring, believing, following a rule. You could try to explain hammering as in more mental activity. But Heidegger said if you really observe it, or to take another of his favorite examples, he said to his students, when you come into the classroom, you must turn the doorknob. But you don't observe the doorknob, believe that you have to turn the doorknob to get in, try to turn the doorknob. All we know is here you are in the classroom and you couldn't have got here without turning the doorknob. You have no memory of it because the whole activity was so transparent it didn't even pass through consciousness. A driver has the same experience shifting from first to second. They do a lot of fancy footwork with the clutch, but they can be carrying on a deep philosophical conversation. It doesn't even have to be conscious.
Although these examples are mundane and trivial, what they actually illustrate is of enormous importance, isn't it? Because what they show is that our conscious act, or even that is begging the question, that our activity is not characteristically determined by conscious choices and aware states of mind at all. And that is of great significance.
That's right. Now, Heidegger didn't want to deny that there was a place for that. He said in his language, first and foremost, we are coping beings already involved in the world. But if something should go wrong, for instance, in the hammer case, if the hammer is too heavy, then I will notice this aspect too heavy, and I'll become a problem solver like the tradition thought human beings were. I'll become a rational animal, and I will say, for this task it's too heavy. If I take another hammer, then it might work better. The kind of Aristotelian practical syllogism. All of that has its place. The same if the doorknob sticks. Then I have to try to turn the doorknob. Heidegger calls that the unready to hand. And he thinks that's the level, I presume that he thinks that's the level at which Husserl came into the story. One crucial step too late. And there is another level while we're at it, which Heidegger calls the present at hand, which is important too. We can get in a stance of just staring at the object. If the head flies off the hammer, for instance, or if the nails are missing, or if we're just feeling in a relaxed attitude of wonder, we can see the hammer as a wooden shank with an iron blob on the end. Then we see it as an object with properties. It weighs, say, 1 pound. That's the level, too, that philosophers have always studied. There's a whole logic of subjects and predicates discussed in what's called the predicate calculus. That has its place, Heidegger would say. But that's a third level down the line, after you've left out the everyday coping and even left out the practical situation in which things can break down, because that hammer isn't even a broken down hammer. It's just a piece of wood with metal on the end. But that's important, too, Heidegger would say, because it's by relating those kinds of predicates with laws that we get science and theory. And Heidegger thought science and theory was very important. He has what he calls an existential account of science in being and time. But what's important to him is to realize that to get to these predicates and laws of science, you have to leave out the whole level of practical coping in the world. So you shouldn't have the idea that scientific theory that can explain causal things very well could ever explain the everyday, meaningful world of significance that Heidegger wants to talk about.
Because what he's saying, in effect, is that we only become conscious of things, in most cases, when something goes wrong, when there's a specific problem. But that for most of the time, we're kind of moving in a medium, we're swimming in a medium that we take utterly for granted and are not conscious of and don't direct our attention to at all. And one consequence of that is that, unlike traditional philosophers, he sees the world as being, not as being something that's inferred. I mean, the traditional philosopher talks as if what I have access to is my mind with its contents, and from these contents I infer the existence of a world external to myself. And Heidegger is saying, no, that is not actually what the situation is at all. The world is not something I infer. I start with it and in it. Is that
That's
not so?
right. The way he put it was that philosophers since Descartes had been trying to prove the existence of the external world, and Kant said that it was a scandal that no one had successfully proved the existence of the external world. Heidegger says in Being and Time, it's a scandal that people are trying to prove the existence of the external world, as if we were stuck with this internal world and couldn't get out, whereas we are, as he puts it, being in the world. I think I should explain that a little bit further, because we've only talked so far about the directedness being not the kind of mental directedness that Husserl was interested in. But any particular directedness of my mind toward the hammer I'm using, of me, not my mind, toward the hammer, using this hammer, takes place on a whole background which he calls the world. The hammer only makes sense in terms of nails and wood and houses and a totality of equipment, which he calls significance. And my skill of hammering only makes sense in a whole background of other skills, of standing and moving and wearing my clothes and talking and so forth. So it's on the background of the world and my capacities for being in that world, or really being of that world, you might say, that anything gets encountered at all. So, as you say, you can't call that into question.
No. And this launches him into forming a view of human beings which is radically different from the traditional philosopher's view of human beings, isn't it? Can you begin to tell us what that is?
Well, certainly he can't talk about subjects or persons or minds, or and he needs a completely new word to even talk about this ongoing activity on a background. And he chooses brilliantly to as a word, Dasein. In German, Dasein means simply existence. Like you earn your daily bread, you would earn your daily Dasein. But it also means, if you take it apart, being the there. And so he thinks that this activity of human being, which he sees as an activity, is an activity of being the there, which for him is being the situation in which this coping is going on. So when I'm driving, there is, if we're looking at that aspect of me which is coping, not at my body, it's just identical with the driving situation. So that being the there is actively being a situation in which directed activity is going on. And that's a completely new understanding of what it is to be a human being. And Dasein also gives him the possibility, as we have with the word human being, of either talking about that activity, human being, or to talk about a human being, an instance of that activity. And he does both.